You were saying about some insights on the MGSA?
Well, actually what I was going to say is that just to comment on this modern Greek historical studies, and I go back and actually I began my serious study of the Balkans and Greece here at Indiana University.
And when was that?
I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 1964, and I started the fall of '64 here, and I studied with Barbara and Charles Yelovich, very prominent Balkan historians. As you might have noted from the information sheet, there were several of us here studying in the modern Greek area under them, and I passed my doctoral qualifying examinations in October 1967, and I came to Greece in November 1967 during the dictatorship on a Fulbright fellowship to do my doctoral dissertation research. At that point in time, there wasn't much that was substantive in 20th century modern Greek history for strange cultural, ultra-nationalistic reasons. So many subjects could not be dealt with, and there weren't trained historians to do a comprehensive archival approach. There were few organized archives in Greece. There were materials available elsewhere, but I would say that there were several of us who ended up doing research on topics. It was basically virgin territory. We had to do we ended up doing very basic research, what by your generation would be considered,
facilities.
But nothing had been done.
You did the 1909 work.
Yeah. What existed in Greek was done by journalists, or was very politically slanted, ultra-nationalist or far left, and not based on what I consider serious research. I came to Greece, it was a question of what could I see?
The dictatorship, yeah. The next question, how did you face problems with your research and the dictatorship?
I did what I could find in the foreign ministry. In fact, I left the foreign ministry archives about 1 o'clock on lunchtime at December 13th, 1967. That was the attempted counter-coup of Constantine. There were armored personnel carriers around Parliament. So, I came out of Zalacosta, which was the old. So had lunch with jets flying low over things. But I ended up relying heavily on what I could find in Greece. There was a lot that was printed. A lot was, if you'll pardon the expression, garbage. There was some substantive stuff, some memoirs. I actually had the opportunity to speak with the son of Thodoros Pangalos, the dictator, who had been secretary of the Military League, and he let me see his photocopy, his father's meeting minutes, which was subsequently, several years later, were published. I saw Stefanos Dargoumis' archives in the Gennadios Library, things like that. But I decided to pursue a heavily, shall we say, I looked at a lot of newspapers. And I still have those microfilms. And I looked at British Foreign Office materials, which were very revealing and informative. And I also had a chance, because they were available and I didn't have to go to Vienna, the Haushof und Staatsarchiv archives of the Austrians. I subsequently used German materials when I expanded into a book, and I saw some other art. But basically I tried to do research in whatever might be possible to cast light on this military revolt.
But using newspaper back then, it was quite innovative, wasn't it? And incorporated into academic work.
I would say yes. And I focused on about 3 newspapers. One which was the mouthpiece of the Military League. There was one, the Acropolis Vlasis the issues. And it was very informative, very informative.
And we are lucky enough to know now another generation, yeah.
I ended up producing something which was a lot of basic research. And it was basic research which I felt then, it was something that someone who would be, not that I was center as such, but it was something that neo-Marxist could with benefit, and Nikos Mouzelis would footnote me and things like, or some who would be more standard conservative could draw on me, because I had done the digging. And there were other historians of that generation. What is very good now is that there are far more archives available. Subjects can be dealt with that could not be touched on in those. I remember 20 years ago to have at a conference, whether in Greece, Turkey, or the United States, that would involve Greeks listening and to papers on the Ottoman experience, Albania, Macedonia hasn't come up really this time around, but it could be done easily. On the Jewish experience, I wrote something, and it wasn't an academic piece at all, on the Sephardic Jews of Salonika back in the late 1970s, and it appeared in 1980, 1981 in the Athenian magazine. It stopped publishing in the 1990s, but it was a very nice publication, and it was on the Jews of Salonika with illustrations. And someone who was associated with the Greek government, when I saw it, asked me, "Are you Jewish?" I said, "No, why?" He said, "Oh, no, somebody asked." I said, "It's in relation to that article that appeared in the Athenian magazine." Well, among the things I mentioned in the first paragraph was that the largest single group in Thessaloniki was Jewish. Yeah, there's still people who don't want to hear it, but it has been written and has been said more recent. But that was 30 years ago. You couldn't.
And the question was, how come you are interested in Jews, or how come you dared say that it was a bigger?
I think it was
interested. Or
yeah. Why should I write it? So thank goodness we have passed by those points.
Before we move on the historians community on modern Greek in America, how did your interest in modern Greek history begin? I mean, as you told me yesterday, you were born in Greece?
No, I was born in New York, and my parents were from Eastern Thrace originally, and both families were involved in the exchange of population, or actually before the formal exchange took place. Ended up in northern Greece. My father's family in Edessa, my mother's family in Arnissa, which is west of Edessa. But my father's experiences sort of got me interested, because my father was from Anatoliki Thraki, Peristasi, or Sharkoi, and he was going to high school in Zografiou Schoolis, Dipoli. To avoid the Turkish military, he went to Romania. There were distant relatives there. And because he had Turkish papers, and Romania entered into the war in the spring of 1916, he was an alien prisoner. The Romanian armed forces did not do very well, and they placed the alien prisoners between the onrushing Germans and Austrians and the retreating Romanians. And he ended up in Odessa, time for the revolution. He and a friend of his from Peristasi, they had a little store several blocks away from General Denikin's headquarters, head of the White Forces, the Bolsheviks. He was able to get out in 1919, ended up in Paris for 4 years, and then came to the U.S. His family was in Peristasi and then involved, his parents and his 4 sisters. Well, that sort of got me into it. I did my undergraduate work at Bowdoin College, which is one of the finest 4-year institutions, liberal arts colleges. And I had a professor, Ernst Helmreich, who wrote what it was probably the best study of the Balkan Wars and the diplomacy of the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913, but still holds up after more than 70 years. So he sort of encouraged me to cultivate this interest. I decided I'd try Balkan history, and I came to Indiana because they had, at that point in time, probably the best program.
On Balkan history or on modern Greek?
No, Balkan.
Balkan history.
No, and see, there aren't that many people going into modern Greek history exclusively as such here in the U.S. because job opportunities wouldn't exist. You have to have Greece in sort of a broader context. I did it within the context of the Balkans. There are others who might do it as dependent upon the historical period, the early 20s, the broader context of Europe. So, and the way the American system differs from the European is that someone has the bachelor's degree would go for a master's degree in history, but there's a lot of coursework involved and a thesis, and then to go for the doctorate, you continue taking courses and you have several fields. You'll have your main field of concentration, in my case was Balkan history, but I had also 20th century Europe as an area, and I had Russian foreign policy as an area. So they're defining areas differently now. And then you have your dissertation field. So I think it prepares you better for teaching, and it also prepares you better for your research and stuff, because you...
It's broad, you have an overview of...
Yeah. You just don't focus in, and you don't focus, and so you have your research is in a vacuum.
But then, after you finished your dissertation around there were several of you working on Greek studies. I mean, it was you, it was Petropoulos,
John Petropoulos, Savrianos was older, and he had his textbook, The Balkans, since 1453, still stands up.
I know.
I mean, it's an incredible study. It's beautifully written. And even though my advisor was Barbara Yelovich, and because I taught 2 courses in Balkan history in my career at Kent State University, I ended up, when Stavrianos' book was reprinted after many years.
Also, he is the previous generation.
Oh, yes. In fact, he was with the OSS during World War II, and he wrote a book. He was always very controversial in Greece. He wrote this book, Greece, American Dilemma, Opportunity, at the height of his post-Truman doctrine, and he was basically very critical of what was U.S. policy at that time. And the academic establishment in Greece was so solidly conservative and ultra-nationalistic, they didn't like it, and they said, the old, how could someone who's of Greek...
He had a textbook.
Yes, it's that textbook.
No, it's not a textbook. I had it as a student, as high school student, the History of Humanity.
Oh, yes, yeah. He then went into world civilization.
It still was αποσύρθηκε.
Yeah.
From the church, because how dare he talk about Darwin in the schools?
I tell my graduate student that there are 3 prominent names in the study of world history. There's Arnold Toynbee, there's an American William Hardy McNeill, then at the University of Chicago, and L.S. Stavrianos. I say they all began their careers writing on Greece and the Balkans. Toynbee did, his first stuff was on Greece. Mm-hmm. William McNeill came to Greece as a military officer, American military, right after liberation. And he wrote some very important studies on Greece, which still stand. And then he has a bibliography like this. And he had been at one point also editor of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies.
Mm-hmm. And Athanasiou Polis is in this?
She was more narrowly, she was a political scientist, and actually someone just asked me if she's still alive. She had been very ill. Well, she was in that generation, and also she was involved heavily with the anti-junta movement here in the U.S. So yes, she contributed, and she did some very important, insightful studies on the Greek political culture.
So it seems that all of your cycle were materialized in a tradition where history and social sciences mixed in a very fruitful way.
Yeah.
And political sciences.
Yeah.
And then it seems stopped. We took over for some years from social anthropology. What happened there?
Oh, it's sort of interesting. Here in the United States, actually, now there's a significant presence of historians and a more diminished presence of anthropologists who have been sort of done. And again, Greece for anthropologists was a nice place to do studies. Nice to go into the field, and you're never that far from the city, and those types of studies. But Greece is a far different place now than when I began working. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. And this, of course, has an impact on those who study Greece. You familiar with the name Nikiforos Diamandouros? Well, he was the ombudsman for Europe. and he was here in the United States, and he was president of the MGSA at one point. He was asked to do a study for a series, Politics and Culture in Greece, overseen by a political science, and he gave my name. And I ended up being one of the few historians, because there was people who were writing on Iran, Japan, Spain. And I put together this thing, and I drew on a lot of the work that by Adipalus and others. I enjoyed reading it, and with bibliography, 40, 45 pages. They wanted something compressed. And there are some things in there that still have relevance today, but there's so many other things that Greece has changed so much in the 25 years or so since I wrote that. I remember one statement that I made in there that basically at any point in time, a Greek will be 100% for a party. And that's not the case now. And I find it, I make the statement too, in the broader context, that in the United States, when I was teaching contemporary post-1945 Europe, and I talk about how America has a big, flabby political middle, conservative Democrats overlap with liberal Republicans, and the polls don't exist, etc. But in Europe, there's no viable real middle. It's right of center to right, left of center to far left. And now I say it's almost the opposite. America has become polarized. This is part of being European Union, but it's also that so many talented Greeks have been educated abroad and then coming back. And now I think the university system is able to accommodate these new people who bring new skills and in turn can influence their students. Because in days gone by, it was a feudal system, the way the universities were set up with the faculty and who would be allowed to go for a PhD and then who would be the successor. There are more positions, but it has opened up in the sense that the good models and the good training from abroad are influencing those who they become part of the system in Greece or influence the system in Greece, so that Greeks educated in Greece now are on a par with those from abroad. I mean, this is impressionistic on my part.
But how did MGSA relate to all this change in Greece? Because for sure, when MGSA was established, then it influenced a traditional understanding of what modern studies should be, both here and in Greece.
Basically, it started with people in literature who had done translations of Saveris, Cavafy, and MGSA became a multidisciplinary organization. And it was a way of bringing people together to interact, and setting up the journal was very important. Initially, it was Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. We were providing the money, but the British were taking all the credit. They were, as editors or whatever, and then we decided, well, we can do it on our own. Mm-hmm. And I think that people in Greece are appreciating the journal as a resource.
Yes.
And now that it's available online, to members or through libraries, it's wonderful that there's talk now about using the MGSA site, as a historical resource. And great things are being done on the transnational dimension. So it's a different mentality too from what it would have been way back. I protopori were great, but what has happened now is that there's a nice, lively, younger generation.
But still, the younger generation found the context, how the context was made. I mean,
it was actually people with, I would say, the right, healthy attitude. You're part of a field, but you're not in it just to promote your own interests. Mm-hmm. You're in it to promote the advancement.
Was it somehow related with the dictatorship? I mean,
that's an excellent question. It might have stimulated in part people, some people saying, what's happening in Greece? And very little was done. A couple of things. One, the 1960s was a period of expansion at American universities with doctoral programs, research specials. I mean, Indiana University was an example on the early part of it. I mean, over 70 languages taught there. There were these special area studies program. Had probably one of the best Soviet and East European studies programs they had. So there was a growing demand in expanding universities to offer specialized fields. That's how I was hired to teach Balkan history. So there were opportunities for people to develop interest in Greece, and that there could be positions available. And there were an increased number, so that brought people together with diverse interests. And the junta part, it was decided early on, the MGSA was criticized in part for this, but as individuals we could do whatever we wanted, but as an organization, because it was an academic organization as such, that it wasn't going to take any official positions. And we had some heavily activist individuals, and Adi Paulus being one example, for the anti-junta struggle. So there was an indirect influence of the Greek experience at that time, the dictator, because there was increased interest in Greece, and as I said, expanding universities, departments, so to accommodate people doing things on Greece. But as an association, it didn't take an official stance. And at the time, there was some concern about, I was just a graduate student at the time, finishing up my dissertation. So, apart from the unfortunate circumstances that Greece finds itself in, I see that there are opportunities for your generation. And it really does contribute to the, to use the term westernization or Europeanization of the Greeks, that they are able to handle issues that could not have been handled 20 years ago.
What about the Balkan Studies, the journal, and the circle of the Institute for Balkan Studies?
Oh, in Thessaloniki?
Yes, in Thessaloniki.
I have had very little.
They made also some conferences in the US, and they had. It was the first.
Oh, the first. Oh, that.
In Wisconsin.
And I was there as a graduate student, and they participated. Vasilis Laourdas, who was then the.
They had a specific ideological. Direction.
Well, it was a sort to revisit Greece since the Truman Doctrine, and I went to it, and it was sort of interesting. And there were some good papers, substantive stuff, and people from different directions, including, what was his name? Dimitris Fatouros, who ήταν πρίτανης at Πανεπιστήμιο της Thessaloniki. He was then on a grant at Yale or something, and he was there. And the timing of it was 9 days later. The junta took him. But I remember there was a guy there who had come from the embassy, Yannis Nikolopoulos, and he had studied in the U.S. and what was his background? Well, he was sort of like the involved with the press and communications of the embassy. And I sort of asked him, because the subject of elections came up. This is when Kanalopoulos, where they said that. Τι λένε για τις εκλογές? He says, έχουμε τις φαλίτσες γεμάτες. Well, and then the junta took over, and it might have been in May, June, I got a phone call from Charles Yelovich, who'd been at the conference with Barbara, or actually, yeah, he had been there, because they knew Laourdas, and he says, John Nikolopoulos wants to become a graduate student. He didn't have a job. Well, Nikolopoulos is a character. He ended up in the Soviet Union. He's been living in Russia. But and he's done some interesting stuff on the Greeks in Russia. Well, this is all anecdotal, but the mission of the Institute for Balkan Studies was to advance Greek national interest. And in 1966, I always tell this story in my Balkan history classes. There was may have been the first sort of international conference on southeastern Europe that was going to be in Sofia, Bulgaria. It was a UNESCO sponsored. And I ended up going with another graduate student from the U.S., some academics from the U.S., including this fellow Theophanis Stavro, who was at the University of Minnesota, on the two buses that were going, the Greek buses going to Sofia. And we stopped for lunch in Blagoevgrad. That's sort of the northern part of Macedonia. And we had lunch, and I remember we were walking, and this woman came up. She heard us speaking Greek, and she was speaking to her. Basically, she said she was Greek, based in Czechoslovakia. You know, it was those who had been in the Civil War. And, you know, she lamented the fact that she couldn't go back with her child to Greece. So we went to this platea, and there was a statue there, like the Balkan War era. And Laurdas, who was the director, he went, looked at the inscription. He had a big smile on his face. And he asked his wife to take a photograph of him with the statue with a big smile. And yeah, naive me, I said, γιατί το χαμόγελο, εμείς τον σκοτώσαμε το 1924. He was a Βούλγαρος, για το μακεδονικό. The equivalent of Pavlo Mela in the statue.
Kind of creepy.
Yeah, so, but it's typical, you know. Well, the mission of the Institute for Balkan. Yeah, fortunately, Vasilis Gondis was director. He's had some very good, solid scholarship. I mean, they had some good people involved and associated with it. I mean, it's become more. A lot of the stuff early on, there was some good stuff, but a lot of it was very nationalistic in its mission. So, all countries have.
So how do you see the future of modern Greek studies here?
Difficult. Part of it has to do with languages, the teaching of the language. Greek is taught at a number of universities, but a lot of it is enrollment driven, as they say. People here have choices. And if you're not going to have many people taking modern Greek, the department may choose to drop. So there are, unfortunately, you know, places like Yale, they have the money to support it, the teaching of, but their enrollments have gone down this past year. So let's hope it's cyclical. The American university job market is a very difficult one.
And it's a matter of marketing also.
It's marketing, yeah. It's marketing. And that's why it goes back to what I had said, that the focus on modern Greece has to be, you have to be able to do other things too. You know, you could do that, or you would end up teaching other things and publishing and doing your research on Greece. I was able to teach a course.
Funding your research to Greek studies by doing other stuff.
Yeah, teaching. So I was able to teach. I taught modern Greek history at Kent State for many years. And one thing I will say that should bring a few smiles to your face. I found it easier to teach modern Greece to American students because of the increased visibility of corruption in the United States. You know, I would point to examples of the city politics and whatever. But I also would tell them, I said, graft and corruption are everywhere. And the differences in corruption are not of kind. They are of degree and style. How it's done and how much of it.
So speaking of that, your opinion about the crisis now in Greece and the stereotypes connected to it?
I've been asked to give a public talk on it. I'm going to try. You know, on the one hand, Varoufakis had some interesting things to say. I wrote this article on British diplomatic reporting on Greek national character in the period between the two wars. And some of the things, the British, in their arrogant way, said some things that were very appropriate for the Greeks then and appropriate for Greeks now. I mean, the Greeks themselves will admit. You know, it's one thing that things like this exist, it's another thing to pay the price for it. And the Greeks are paying the price for it. The Italians do just as much of it. they could afford it a little more.
Spanish also.
Yeah, Spanish. I mean, the black, the para economy and whatever, they exist in these societies.
But for example, I was in Spain for some months.
Yeah.
The discourse, the public discourse was exactly the same. About the lazy Spanish, the don't work, the corruption. It was like transferring the same discourse from...
But you know, Varoufakis, I got to give him credit. I can't remember his exact wording, but my wife is from Thessaloniki, and she'll be the first to say, you know, she was glad that we got married to leave Greece, to leave a lot of stuff behind. But she turned, there was this period when Greece started becoming increasingly comfortable, and some of her friends from Anatolia College who got their university education ended up coming to the U.S. because their husbands and whatever were involved with, you know, for the Greek business here in the U.S. And they would complain, here in the United States, people work too hard. But remember la perception of the United States probably infuriates you to hear that, but you know people like that.
Yes, kind of.
You know,
for my generation, because it's very difficult to.
I mean,
with one job, you must do many jobs in order to say.
You know, and Varoufakis in one way mentioned something that I've said, and actually William McNeill had brought it out in one of his books. The Greeks suffer from bad models, bad paradigms. I'll give a simplistic example. I drive respectably here in the U.S. I go to Greece, I drive like a Greek. It's the only way to survive. And the only way you can survive in Greece is to be like them. I have friends here who've been educated in the 60s here, had university positions, they returned to Greece, and they were going to bring new spirit, and they said, we have to survive. That's it. I've become like them. The Greeks, immigrants, they came to the United States, my father was considered the educated one. He almost finished high school because of that generation. 2-3 years of elementary school in the Peloponnese, Latvia, and then the U.S. They worked very hard here. They had a very low crime rate among immigrant groups, and usually it was because they were involved in gambling somehow. That would be their crime. Violence and they saw the system and how they could work hard, they'd be rewarded, and they provide a better life for their kids. And so the Greeks in the U.S., among immigrant groups back in I guess the census indicated this in the 1970s, that among immigrant groups it was the Greeks and the Jews were 1-2 in the second and third generation for per capita income and per capita years of education. And the Greeks have done well in Germany, they've done well in Australia, because there are more positive paradigms in front of them and they can benefit by playing the right role. In Greece, the rules are the opposite. Yeah, I'm simplifying, but...
Now in the States with the Greek crisis, is there a demand, an increased demand for Greek Americans to talk to American media or somewhere like that?
There was more so than there is now,
1-2 years before.
Yeah. Where I'm retired now, there are a lot of retired people, professionals, U.S. Foreign Service, academics, doctors, and they have what they call a senior college, the Mid-Coast Senior College. They have retirees teaching classes for retirees. You don't get paid. And I taught one, Greece, Country in Crises. I dealt really with the 20th century. And one of the best teaching experiences I ever had. They were very interested and they were very interesting because they came from such different backgrounds. But they had a real interest. They wanted to read and I'd give them stuff and we had wonderful discussions. But there aren't many places in the U.S. actually that have courses on modern Greece history as such. Very few.
So, thank you very much for your time.